Good morning from London and welcome to this latest session of Talking Architecture, brought to you by World Architecture Festival and the Inside World Festival of Interiors. And we've been speaking to contributors and friends of the festival about the subject of the moment, which is of course the world in a COVID and post-COVID condition, but also in relation to our own main topic at WAF this year, which is the greening of cities, which has taken on a broader implication than pre the virus crisis. There are two guests today from World Architecture Festival. It's curator Jeremy Melvin, an author, critic, visiting professor at the Bartlett School of Architecture, University College London. And our special guest, a warm welcome to Heather Dodd from Savage and Dodd Architects in Johannesburg, a practice founded at the end of the 20th century and in the last 2 decades has earned itself an enviable reputation for its interest, amongst other things, in matters of equity and social justice. And just to kick us off, Heather, I wonder if I could ask you to comment on, firstly, on a project of yours which won a WAFX Award in the Power and Justice category for a proposal for a mixed building. And then perhaps tell us about 1 or 2 other projects that you've recently completed or you might be working on, which are looking at this question of various forms of equity.
Thanks, Jeremy. Well, the project that won the WAFX Award was a conversion of a tower. I'm just going to move across, which is actually just here, and that is a 30-story, 20-story tower building, and that is was a corporate office for a bank, and the idea behind that was to look at the conversion of it to residential. But not only that, was to reconsider its position in the city and the impact that providing equitable housing in the city can impact, not only in terms of equity on that level, in terms of diversity and access to affordable housing in the city, but also how that building engages into the public realm of the city and what it does. Can it draw the public realm into the building? Can it provide social space and re-engage in the city to provide social justice? And it's a very particular challenge in South Africa, because although it's been 25 years since the end of apartheid, the structural issues, the spatial structural inequity in the city is still there. It's something that we haven't overcome. So if you look at maps of census results by race, for example, you'll still see that there's enormous spatial division over the geography of the city. So, you know, everything that we then do must somehow work towards breaking that, towards providing equity. So whatever we do in terms of our buildings really matters. It's not just the building, it's how that building engages in the public realm.
Thank you. And tell us about 1 or 2 other projects, perhaps of a similar nature, that you've been working on.
We've been working on a variety of affordable housing projects, which take former industrial type buildings in the inner city of Johannesburg, buildings that no longer serve the purpose which they were built for in the 1950s. Industry and factories simply don't exist like that. So if Amazon are going to build a factory or a data center, they're simply not going to be located there anymore. So these are empty, sometimes derelict buildings, and we are looking at converting them into housing. And in doing so, they require a series of spatial tactics, breaking light wells into the building, joining buildings together, and then considering how one might create a variety of housing typologies within one building to allow access at a lower rental level, family type housing, etc. So trying to look at alternative typologies. Can you have shared units? Can you have very, very tiny units which allow people to have a place in the city, but perhaps a home outside the city which they go home to at certain times? I mean, obviously COVID starts to ask other questions of the buildings, is that, as things become tighter and smaller, are we really providing the kinds of spaces that when people are locked into buildings, they can actually still thrive in? And I think that that's still quite a challenge.
Now, I think in some of the areas that you work, both geographically and typologically, there's always this question about whether architects are dependent on wise or informed or ambitious clients, or to what extent do architects with an interest in this, both as designers and as citizens, become players in the process? So it's not simply designing to somebody else's brief, but it's helping to formulate that brief and proselytizing, if you like, in favor of certain forms of more equitable distribution of space in the city.
Yes, I think so, Paul. I mean, in our latest projects where we're working with existing buildings, there's obviously the envelope of the building, which is always going to be the parameter with which we have to work, but we always have to try and see how much we can push within that envelope. But I think that in our work over the last 20 years, we really are trying to always find the gap, if I could say that. So how do we find the gap to do something that's slightly different or can result in something more meaningful? And I go back to one of the first social housing projects that we did in Johannesburg, where the social housing policy that was newly formulated only funded a unit. So, if you think about social housing, it's really about the fact that it's not about the housing, it's about the environment. So if you have no money to make an environment, how do you do it in a new typology? And what we did there is we said, let's make a live-work unit, and let's make it that the retail is actually part of the unit. So we're actually funding a unit, but actually we've created so much more. And we've created a permeable edge and all of those kinds of things that start to engage in the city. So it's always about thinking about, can we find the gap or the little point to push in and to make something more meaningful?
Thank you. But I'd like to bring in Jeremy Melvin at this point to perhaps offer some thoughts on not so much what we do with the post-industrial city or how we might improve current circumstances. I think we'll come to that a bit later. But what historically have been the ideas which have informed the development of cities, and indeed the spatial relationships between different groups of people? What has informed city planning, whether informal or super formal?
I think the overwhelming urge behind city creation and therefore behind city planning is the pursuit of, in quotes, the good life. And this is inherent in the first thinkers on city planning in the Western tradition, Plato, Aristotle, and of course the first town planner, or the person who Aristotle credits as the first town planner, Hippodamus of Miletus, who gave us the gridded city. Still a hugely important way of thinking about cities and of creating them. So the good life then includes all sorts of things, and of course those are elaborated at great length and with great insight by the philosophers from Plato and Aristotle onwards. But they include governance. So how is a city governed? Who indeed is eligible to be involved with the governance of a city. Now, we may not agree with Plato and Aristotle, who don't quite agree themselves about that, about who might be involved. Now, I mean, Aristotle thinks that democracy is the least harmful way of governing a city, although what he meant by democracy is perhaps not what we would mean. But then governance also includes the economy, and it also includes health. And of course, in the UK at least, in the industrial and post-industrial era, health was probably the single biggest factor in creating cities and indeed adapting old ones. And one thinks of the measures that were taken during the plague of 1666, which did involve what we now call a lockdown, maybe not quite the same as we've had, but similar, drawing on similar principles, which is how do you break the chain of infection. And then up to the 19th century, when for the first time the risk of dirty water was recognised as a health issue by a doctor called John Snow, who realised that an awful lot of cholera cases emanated from one particular water pump in Soho. And that led, by various twists and turns, to the creation of the Metropolitan Board of Works in 1855, which the first task of which was to sort out the condition of the Thames, which had become an open sewer. And indeed, it had become so bad that the House of Commons, recently reopened to the designs of Pugin and Barry, had become uninhabitable because the smell emanating from the river was so bad. And of course, so, water, health, air quality, preventing infection, and then some corollaries to that, such as food supply, all involved city planning. And of course, until 1947, well, actually slightly earlier, 1941 or 42, it was the Ministry of Health in the UK that oversaw city planning. And still has, there's still a role in that. So I would say, as I say, it's all about stemming from what makes the good life. And the good life involves people being healthy, and it involves also a functioning economy.
Now, just on that point of economy, you have written about the way that city planning in, let's say, Saxon Britain, for example, and then on into the medieval period, had to balance out the different worlds of commerce on the one hand, the market, the economy, and the world of religious thought and observance on the other. Were there patterns of city planning that were established at that time, which have fed through? I mean, not just in the UK, but in all cities in the world have some sort of relationship between commerce and religion and indeed culture. Are there sort of DNA strands in our cities that can help us understand what we may have to do in the post-COVID condition?
Well, Lewis Mumford, one of the greatest thinkers on cities in the 20th century, argued that cities have to combine the features of sanctuary, so religious significance, some form of commerce or interaction, which could also stand for the creation of culture, and thirdly, the availability of supplies, and of course defence. Now, all those were brought to a head by the English King Alfred, who reigned in the late 9th century, something like, was it 870 to 900, that sort of period, who is not only the first king of England who had been to Rome and was almost certainly literate, or at least semi-literate, but he faced an existential threat to his kingdom, which was the Viking invasions. And he turned to city planning to solve that, or to mitigate that. And what he did was to create the burrs. And this is a really important element, at least in English urbanism. And I say English rather than British urbanism because the experience of Scotland, Wales and Ireland is quite different. And the burrs combined all the built settlements in a particular area within a defendable space. They were located about 20 miles apart from each other, so you could, about a day's march, that is, so they could be supported relatively quickly by reinforcements if they came under attack. And what it meant was that they then had their religious centre, and the classic example is Winchester, which was Alfred's capital, where you've got the Winchester Cathedral, and the sort of religious axis. You typically have three streets, one devoted to religion, the cathedral or the main church, and then the two on either side. One would be the civic street, so the place of civic governance, and then the third was for commerce, and off it would go all sorts of little alleyways which would be devoted to particular trades. So the armourer, the baker, the shoemaker, whatever, would all have their own locations, but situated in, as it were, the commercial part of the city. And I suspect people who have designed shopping centres would recognise the sense of that. Now, this Alfred was interested in urbanism and urban planning. He was certainly interested in how his subjects could live the good life. And for him, that involved religion, commerce, and good governance, good civic governance. And that became the inscribed form of many pre-industrial English cities. And I think what was happening at the time of Alfred was a revival of monasticism led from Cluny, the so-called Cluniac movement, which he didn't really have time to get involved with, but some of his successors, and indeed some of the people associated with his successors, like St. Swithin, St. Dunstan, St. Ethelwald, were all known as founders of abbeys. Now, because of the burr policy of concentrating all settlement in one location, that meant that unusually in England, cathedrals also combined with abbeys or monasteries. And so pre-industrial English cities have the paraphernalia of a monastery attached to them in the city centre. Now that includes things like fish ponds, orchards, so horticulture and agriculture, vineyards. I mean, very close to Westminster Abbey, there were vineyards belonging to the Abbey, for example. And you can still see this. If you go to a city like Durham in the north of England, you can still see how the horticulture, agriculture, nature, in other words, came right into the heart of the city. Now, if you contrast that with the great French Gothic cathedrals, and I'm thinking particularly of Amiens and Chartres, the secular world, the world of commerce, could abut directly those great cathedrals, which in England very rarely happen. The exception is Old St. Paul's Cathedral in the City of London, which was not an abbey, didn't have an abbey attached to it. And this, I think, shows, it has a very, very strong effect on the way cities were governed, because of course the cathedrals and the abbeys were very much involved with the governance of the realm well into the early modern period. And the commerce, the nature of commerce and where commerce could take place, and where different things happened in a city. So all those things that we think of as city planning were there in embryonic form in Alfred's plan.
Thank you very much. And I wanted to bring that in because although it may sound slightly obscure bit of English history, the relevance of it today, I think, has become more and more evident. That's to say, a notion of space at the heart of a city, the notion of growing food at the heart of the city, and at another level, the fact that the three streets referred to were places where anybody could go. There was a notion, in other words, of spatial equity, the routes in the city, that no one was prohibited from using them. And I wonder if I can turn to you, Heather, and ask you whether you recognize in Johannesburg or other cities where you have worked, similar strands where citizens are equal in this space, and that in a sense defines the nature of a city. The old German medieval phrase, Stadtluft macht frei. City life makes you free because you're not tied to a rural existence. Does any of that chime with what you see around you?
Well, I mean, I come back, Enrique Peñalosa from Bogota has that phrase where he said that the streets are where the equity of the city happens. I mean, Johannesburg is a particularly, you know, is grappling with a lot of things. I mean, at its base, Johannesburg is a colonial has a colonial underlay that was built on, that then had another layer of spatial segregation. So, you know, disease, for example, that you bring up, was used in the early part of the 20th century as a way of taking people out of the city, removing them, and putting them in dormitory townships, and splitting the city. So, you know, taking industry out of the city, taking people of color that you didn't want to live in the city, taking them out of the city. So we have that enormous structural inequity to overcome. So our city has changed tremendously in the last 20 years. So, and the streets, I think, is where it happens. I mean, the streets of Johannesburg now would be unrecognizable probably to somebody who would port back from the 1970s or 1980s. So that's the challenge. And then the challenge is saying, you know, how do you then make a healthy city where, you know, modernism said that you needed to split out things in the city. But in some instances, our city has those same challenges that the Victorian cities have. I mean, if you go to places into the city, you would be transported back into a Dickensian world. That is horrific. You know, if you were looking at how do I create a healthy city, I think the movement forward in all cities is to look at the multiplicity of functionality in the city, because we've taken so much out of the city and tried to put it in other places, as you say, things like agriculture, things, you know, we've said a shopping center is a shopping center, and an office is an office, and a home is a home. But how do we actually start to mold those all together? Because at the moment, our cities are not resilient at all in terms of being healthy places to live in.
Now, this raises the question of density of occupation of our cities and our buildings. Jeremy, roughly speaking, modernism didn't like mixed. It liked everything to be neat and separated and zoned. And this led, in some cases, to ideal towns being proposed or even built, where there was strict separation of uses, and you could see very, very different densities or levels of intensity at different times of day in an utterly predictable manner. More recently, people have been more interested in going back to the messy, mixed-use street life of the sort that Heather is describing, albeit hopefully in a healthier condition than it was in 19th century industrial slums. I suppose what I'm wondering is whether we're going to start looking for a new sort of paradigm in relation to cities where, yes, we may like them to be mixed, we may like them to be relatively dense, but we now have extreme concerns about intensity of use and intensity of occupation, certainly in current conditions because of the pandemic. Will this lead to a new attitude where we want we want gathering with distancing, rather than what historically big gatherings have always been intense. You know, the cathedral used once a week, but when it is used, it's extremely intense. Ditto the stadium, ditto the concert hall.
I can't answer for the sort of precise, biology of infection. So I don't know whether the risk of infection from COVID or indeed any other virus will be able to be mitigated by things like face masks or other methods that will allow us to get closer to each other than we're allowed to be at the moment. But I want to come back to the point about density, because of course a person who did probably more than anyone else to sing the virtues of density for the potential for interaction was Jane Jacobs, and not just in her description of the street in New York where I think she lived in Death and Life of Great American Cities, but also in the later and less well-known book, but equally interesting, I think, called The Economy of Cities, where she shows how the sort of serendipitous borrowing of techniques or ideas from one business by another in an adjacent building or a different floor in the same building or whatever could lead to a breakthrough. And that, I think, is shown empirically on numerous occasions. So there are some big sort of virtues in density if we accept my opening premise, which is really the urge to city planning is the creation of the conditions for a good life. Now, I want to come back to a point Heather made about streets. I think it's really interesting that, yes, some of the areas, some of the township areas of Johannesburg and other cities in South Africa are Dickensian, except for one thing. In Dickens' London, employment, such as it was, very low paid, low skilled, was located close to those rookeries, as they were known, those slums. So, for example, one of the worst rookeries was where the law courts in the Strand now are, and that was full of scriveners, people who just made a living copying legal documents. Very low paid. Obviously, you had to be literate, but it was it was obviously piggybacking off the legal district of London, of which it's a part. Now, so employment was close to the centre of population. And that is, of course, what apartheid absolutely denied. It meant that you had to live at some distance remove from your place of work, whatever it was, whether it was a factory, whether it was, as a domestic servant in a may I say, white-owned house, and you had to travel. And that travel has become more and more fraught, more and more dangerous, and indeed subject to criminal control in many cases, as I understand it in South Africa. Correct me if I'm wrong, Heather. And this is a direct consequence of 19th century ideas about how to deal with the industrial city. Ebenezer Howard and Raymond Unwin have quite a lot to answer for here, but so does the progenitors of the Newtown movement, Frederick Osborne, for example, in England, in the UK. And the whole Newtown movement, and indeed, to be fair to Howard, the Garden City movement, which slightly predates it, was about trying to make self-contained communities. Now, on the whole, they were failures. What they did at their best was to create quite congenial places to live, not all that far from London, such as Letchworth Garden City, or the new towns like Hemel Hempstead or Stevenage or Crawley, where you can commute to London. You could buy, in the 1960s, with a cheap loan, because government was encouraging home ownership, you could buy a home and you could commute to London. So your working opportunities were much, much greater, but at some distance removed from where you lived. Now, what we're seeing now is that people are going to be more and more reluctant to travel, particularly on public transport. And technology, such as what we're using at the moment, to some extent at least, offsets the need to travel to work. Now, I think the effects here are going to be really interesting, because I think in the UK, house builders are going to have to completely rethink what they offer, because no one is going to buy a home that doesn't have capacity for working at home. That may have to be a separate room, it may be a convertible garage, or it may be an attic space, or it may be just space to build a shed in the garden, something like that. But that sort of flexibility is going to become really, really important. And the other thing that will be really important is access to outdoor leisure space. And in the UK, we've been allowed out of our homes once a day for up to an hour. And if you live, as I'm fortunate enough to do, within easy access of quite large open spaces, that's fine. But if you don't have access to such spaces, or if those spaces are too small and get crowded, you're really in a bad state. So I think those are things that are going to affect it. And it's going to be about tracing the relationship between where you live and how you work and how you take your leisure and exercise and all sorts of other things.
Yes, very good point about commuting, because we've noticed across the world that the poorest people are expected to travel for the longest time to get into work because their time is not regarded as valuable. A very interesting example of complete social inequity. Well, I think Jeremy's comments have mainly answered a question we've had in from one of our attendees. Will the current pandemic be a good time for planners and architects to rethink how spaces affect individuals, families, and communities? And Heather, would you like to comment on this question of people living somewhere near to where they work? Is there any sign that probably welcome trend is happening through this mixing up that you referred to?
Yes, well, I mean, you know, it's a much more complex equation than now, because you know we now live in cities that are multinodal. You know, it is not the case now that you work in one place in the city. So, you know, what COVID has done to the cities of South Africa is really crack open the structural inequity that hasn't been resolved, and that is that people, poorer people, do not live close to where they work and are expected to be able to move vast distances with long commuting times across the city, which is dangerous and in many respects now. So, you know, are they going to be sitting on a bus for an hour and catch COVID? So that's the big problem, and of course that all this that many service industries are dependent on people using public transport with long commutes. So that's the essence of the problem. So how do you mesh these three things together, which are living, working, and commuting? And again, density, because obviously or not obviously, but in some cases, the cheapest places to live are the densest places and the smallest spaces, without access to good quality or open spaces, whether those are in the city or open parkland. So that's extremely challenging. I mean, would you like to be locked in a 15 square meter space for 6 weeks is the question, without being able to go outside? And if you go outside into the street, that's not a very nice place to be either. So these are very challenging things for us to have to grapple with, and how do we do that? We don't have the answers yet. I mean, the answers are clear from a design perspective, but the actual implementation and how we get there is very complex.
Well, here's a question for both of you. I'll ask you to respond first, Heather. This is from one of our attendees, Jenkin Javine Frago. Welcome. Has the pandemic been a good opportunity for cities to explore other mobility options like cycling. Everyone's crazy about it in London. How is it in Joburg?
Well, that's an interesting thing. I mean, the problem is, again, distance, proximity and distance. So, interestingly enough, the last mayor of Johannesburg brought in cycling lanes into the inner city. Complete disaster, cost a lot of money, completely unusable. What they're being used for is for taxis to park in. I mean, they're completely dysfunctional. But the question is, I mean, you know, can you cycle 30 kilometers in either, you know, 12 degrees or 30 degrees? And the question and the answer is probably is no, just from a distance. So cycling works in those in smaller cities where distance isn't so much of an issue. But in Johannesburg, those things are just too, the proximity of work to living is too fast, and it's too dangerous, and it's too hot or too cold.
I may say that in London, there's been a huge investment in cycling facilities, and they solved the question of people parking in cycling lanes by putting great big curbs in, so that it's quite impossible for anybody to do anything with them except use them for cycling. And the proponents of cycling in London, I think they're on a high at the moment. Unprecedented numbers of people are using bicycles. I think, Jeremy, you're about to buy an electric bike. You've been a
I have bought an electric bike. I mean, I live on the top of the highest hill in London, which is not very high. I mean, it's about 130 meters above sea level. But coming home in the evening when you're tired, and it's a sort of London winter, which means you've got rain, which is a bit cold, cycling up a hill at a 1 in 10 gradient is quite hard work, and I've done it many, many times. So I thought, now I'm getting on a bit, I should try an electric bike. Now, electric bikes are, for me, a really interesting piece of kit, because obviously they've been around for some time, but several things have happened in the last few years. One is, and it's basically about batteries. Batteries have got more and more powerful. In other words, they can store more and more power, and they got lighter and lighter. When electric bikes first came on the scene, you had to have quite a heavy battery for not very long range, and that meant you had to have a heavy frame. So it all became a sort of downward spiral of not quite being worth it. Now, and I haven't taken delivery of this bike yet, it's somewhere apparently in a shipping container between the coast of Greece and the coast of France, and I'm hoping to get it in the next couple of weeks or so. They have a range of, on one battery of 26 miles, it's about 40 kilometers, about the same as a marathon, and they are much lighter. Now, I think I'm going to have to relearn how to cycle, because the bike has a single gear. Now, where on anyone who's cyclist knows about going uphill, you try and pedal at the same rate, but you change into a lower gear so that it becomes easier as you take in the gradient. Now, I think one's just going to have to use the power in the way one used gears on a more conventional bike. But I will be very interested to see whether this really is a way of doing, as Heather says, the 30 kilometers. Now, in 12 degrees, that will be fine. In 30 degrees, cycling 30 kilometers is hard work. But whether that means that the range of realistic cycling increases, I think it probably will. Now, London is on the whole, though it's a large city, the distances are on the whole not so large that they are not cyclable by a reasonably experienced cyclist for most journeys. But maybe the battery will allow more people to do that. Maybe it'll slightly increase the range. Incidentally, you charge, I think, as I understand it, with something like a phone charger. So the technology is available if you go into a cafe, or certainly if you go into an office, to recharge your battery. You can also carry a spare one with you, so that would double your range, but they're quite expensive, so I'd be mean enough to buy myself just one.
Okay, we've got a couple more questions coming in. Now, this first one, I'm going to ask you to comment on this, Heather, and then we'll move on to one for Jeremy. So for Heather, this is from Jesu Celine. Will the pandemic lead to the redefining of office spaces with more work from home and offices used for meetings and discussions only, thus reducing the frequency of visitors? What are the design interventions that we should be considering? Now, perhaps you can tell us what's happened with your own office first, Heather, because I know a lot of architects, of course, have been able to experiment with what they're suggesting that clients might do with their space in relation to how they dealt with their own staff and premises.
So in our office, and we have a very small office, and also we have a live-work arrangement. We the entire bottom of our house is a studio, and and we live above. So that's been great for lockdown because we haven't left the office in a sense. But with our staff coming in, so we've worked remotely for the first part of lockdown, and then since we've been able to be operational, we've had 2 people. We've split our office in 2, and we have 2 people coming in on alternate days. With the pandemic increasing, it's starting to peak in Johannesburg. We've now backed off a bit, and we're going down to 1 person coming in a day. So I think density of the office is something that that everybody's looking at in bigger spaces as well. So the interesting thing is what businesses can work remotely and what don't. I mean, I think it also comes down to the fact that we see clearly that some businesses have pivoted very quickly to being able to work remotely. But in the end, I think in the longer term, there are 2 issues that would be important. One is that, do people actually have the space to work at home? So, I mean, in all cities, all big cities have a premium on living space. So, you know, if you're sitting in your bedroom with your computer on your lap, is that a sustainable workspace for years? No, probably isn't. And the other thing is that we are, at our basis, social beings, and that it is quite hard to work remotely for long periods of time. I think some pieces of work, some businesses work easier and can be done remotely, but others, you require their interaction of people, and digital interaction is not quite the same, I think we found. So I think that in the coming years, there's going to maybe be more hybrid solutions of people working from home, people working in different shifts, different densities, perhaps in offices. Maybe if you are working at home, being able to go into some sort of meeting, some contact spaces or remote or office spaces that you can go into. I don't think that it's a complete death of the office.
No, I think a couple of perspectives from discussions that the British Council for Offices has been having in recent weeks. Firstly, there will probably be a trend towards avoiding touching anything where it's unnecessary. And this will be an acceleration of a trend that has already started. So do you really have to press buttons on a lift? And the answer is probably not. Do you have to ever touch taps in the restrooms? Well, no, it's all remote sensors. So one could see a sort of a less touchy working environment. And the dilemmas that I think the people looking at workspace have been grappling with. Firstly, a really big one, which is the condition of the air as opposed to air conditioning. In other words, the last thing you want in a COVID or post-COVID condition is anything which is recycled rather than expelled. Okay, you could clean it and recycling, but essentially you no longer want systems where you're reliant on recirculated air, which is frequently the case. So huge amounts of work being done by services engineers to examine the condition and often even the facts of how air systems work in offices, it's surprising how often it turns out that no one really knows from the office tenant's point of view. Somebody knows, but it's not necessarily obvious who it is. And the second thing is the core, and in particular, the lavatories, because depending on that, that is going to partly determine your circulation routes within the office. The multi-tenanted buildings, the routing may be easier because there are probably multiple exits. So you can have an entrance and an exit route, but with smaller ones, that may be slightly more difficult. Once you get to a tenant's interior space, it may become very difficult indeed, at which point you then revert to perhaps only having half the people in the office at any one time. So I think the view amongst the investment community also is that we don't assume that companies will only need half the office space that they used to, because the chances are that they'll still want some people in the office some of the time, and the offices will simply be occupied at a far lower density. So we probably will need better new space, which may leave the way open to the conversion of offices for residential accommodation, where you can plan your post-COVID existence more fruitfully, and hopefully more home working space. I want to move to a more general question. This is from Eleni Philippa. This one's for you, I think, Jeremy. During the current period, I've been wondering whether we ever really left the post-pandemic period of the Spanish flu and the effects it had on architecture and urban planning by motivating the modern movement. I feel as though we're living in a merging of pandemic effects on planning. We sort of partly referred to this already. Any observations on that?
I think it's a very interesting point, because there's definitely a relationship between health and efficiency that informed modernism. I think that much of that, though, was underway before the Spanish flu, in other words, before the First World War, with works in London, with the idea of the Garden City movement, which starts, Howard's, A Path for Peace or Reform, was published in 1898, and the lecture started in 1903. But it's very much there, the idea that health is the driving force of not just architecture, but the whole phenomenon of planning. And indeed, one can see the role of architects and planners, rather as it is with doctors at the moment, to get the ear of politicians and to pull the levers of power. Now in the UK, architects did have a sort of little finger around a few of the minor levers of power between the 1950s and perhaps the 1970s. I'm thinking of people like Leslie Martin and Richard Llewellyn Davis, who were influential in policy formation. Now, much of that is to do with an incredibly clever, but I suspect largely accidental, sleight of hand that the architectural and planning community managed to achieve in the 1940s, which was to make politicians think that planning was the same, whether it was physical and spatial planning and economic planning. Economic planning was what was believed to have won the war, because it allowed the motivation of full resources, like women went into the workplace, and men on the whole, there were some exceptions, were allocated to fighting, and the British economy was seen to have been very successful at that, as indeed was the American economy, with perhaps more demonstrable results. And in the meantime, while that was happening, there was a very interesting sort of shadowy process going on, which was the evolution of town planning in the UK, because the first Ministry of Town and Country Planning was created as a result of the Barlow Commission, and indeed the Minority Report from the Barlow Commission, written by Patrick Abercrombie, a hugely influential planner of the time, professor at UCL. And so you get the idea that town and country planning is the same as economic planning. And I think that it's that sleight of hand that suited politicians, particularly those on the soft and centre left, but not exclusively so, who were looking for a sort of technocratic solution to how to make a good society. And this seemed to be it. That you can use planning not just to deal with health, with the Spanish flu or whatever, but also to have things like social justice, to have full employment, all things which were seen as having been ills of the 1930s, and indeed, if you go to Spanish flu, of the late teens and early 1920s. So I do think there's something there, and I think Eleni's point is a good one, that actually you could see that the use of disease as the carrot that the planning community used to attract politicians to their way of thinking. That may be a slightly cynical view, but I think there's some truth in it.
Well, I think that leads on to another related question from Mustafa Kamal Zulkarnain. And he's asking a question, I'll ask you both to comment on this, perhaps you first, Heather, which is that, I'm paraphrasing now, will decentralization be the future of cities? And that relates to Jeremy's last point, which is the whole creation in the UK and in many other countries of new towns, which are separate entities and are geographically separated from the old, unhealthy industrial city, are more spacious, allow a more pleasant life, garden cities, if you will. What are the chances of us simply saying, well, actually, cities are not great places to be anymore? What we should be doing is reviving the notion of the garden city and building at lower densities and creating places where people can live and work within cycling distance or walking distance or whatever it may be. Heather.
So I think that's actually an interesting point that I was actually going to say. I mean, you know, are we going back to the suburbs or the new towns or the outlying towns and at lower densities where that's actually the opposite to what we've been talking about in terms of building resilient cities over the last number of years in terms of the environmental movement. And I think that comes back to, you know, what are the opportunities and linkages that exist when you do that. I mean, I would say that in our cities that would probably be disastrous because of the fact that our transportation doesn't exist properly to service our existing cities at the densities and the sprawls that they currently are at. And if we had to, and unless we fix that, that's not going to work as a situation going forward. Otherwise, you know, we're all going to still be, the rich will be in their little cars with their gardens, and the rest will be struggling, you know, to actually live in the city. So I think that's going to be a very interesting question. I see Rem Koolhaas last year, I think that he started to talk about, was it the horizontal city or the suburban city or the flat city? I can't remember, Paul. But I think that's a very interesting thing, and I think it has its. I think it's an interesting debate to have and to see what are the advantages of all. But I think that that's going to have an equity impact because I think, again, it's going to be the rich in society that can do that, whereas the poor can't. And if we want to have resilient cities that are equitable cities, we're going to have to look at repurposing our existing cities to and existing buildings, and coming back to what you were talking about in terms of office buildings. You know, maybe it's the death of the deep space building and the big box supermarket, where people are going to feel safer being on the street in the open and going to the smaller shop with less people density. So that in itself then opens up opportunities for building typologies and how we might repurpose buildings that are going to be underutilized, or maybe have other uses layered on top of them.
And Jeremy, I suppose we tend to talk in these discussions as though the world and cities are a single entity, but of course they're very different in many different ways. I wonder whether actually in some societies and some economies, the idea of new towns and garden cities may be very attractive and very practical, even if it's not the case elsewhere.
Well, I think it's very interesting. One of the most successful modern states, Singapore, conceives itself as a garden city state. And, you know, looking at it, the visual evidence is that is a fairly accurate description of it, using every opportunity to plant and taking a great deal of care through planning, both economic and spatial, incidentally, to provide some semblance of equity. I don't know what Singapore's Gini coefficient is, but it certainly takes care of many of its poor citizens, provided they're citizens as opposed to Gastarbeiter. But I think there are 2 points I'd like to make. Firstly, London is the original multimodal city. Perhaps Rome slightly predates it, because when Rome became a Christian city, it had to become multimodal because the city plan geared around the Republican and imperial polity then had to incorporate the Christian sites, many of which were on the outskirts. They were free les murs, as one might say. But London was multinodal from the word go, with the city and with Westminster. And then each of them spawned suburbs, which suited their particular needs. So Westminster spawned royal and aristocratic enclaves. The city spawned artisanal enclaves like Shoreditch or Southwark or other fringe locations, Clerkenwell. Now, each of these were suburbs, and some of the most successful locations that we now think of as being inner city London started off as suburbs: Mayfair, South Kensington, Notting Hill, Southwark I've just mentioned, Shoreditch. So I think we don't have to fear the suburbs. What we have to fear is bad planning. I think it's a far bigger thing, that suburbs can be good and they can be bad, just as city centres can be good and they can be bad. The other thing that I think is really important in considering the concept of garden cities, the original Howard's idea was that the estate on which the garden cities sat would be big enough to be self-supporting in food. In other words, it would have agriculture. Now, of course, the sort of people who moved to the early garden cities like Letchworth wove their own knickers and made their own lemonade, and they certainly didn't want to brew beer because they're almost certainly teetotal. But that aspect, I think, has been lost. And I think it is a really major flaw in the way we think about cities. I mean, there's some semblance now. I'm thinking of, the very regrettably late Michael Sorkin and his plans to use Manhattan to grow enough food to feed itself. But I think that what has been overlooked is the relationship between cities and growing cities and their agricultural hinterland. And I think one only needs to look at Lorenzetti's allegories of good and bad government in the Palazzo Pubblico in Siena to realize that a good city has a positive relationship with its agricultural hinterland, just as a bad city has a poor relationship with it. And I think we need to rediscover that sort of thinking.
I think that's a very good note to conclude our session. There were several other questions which I hope I've made a note of them, which we might address on another occasion. I think the most interesting of which was from Shane Carpio. So I'll leave everybody to have a little think about this. As the COVID-19 emerged, the line between virtual reality and reality has blurred. Placemaking in public spaces becomes suddenly irrelevant. We can communicate through anything, I'm paraphrasing, by YouTube. You can do things you weren't able to do before now using the internet. More and more people are gaining access to the information cloud. The growth now is not on focus of the urban, but the flow of information. Will new spaces be introduced in an urban setting and in architecture to reflect those new possibilities of the virtual. I'm going to leave that question hanging in the air. I think it's a fascinating one that I'm sure we'll return to in another issue of Talking Architecture. But for now, can I thank Jeremy Melvin for his contribution, and in particular Heather Dodd coming in from Johannesburg, virtually of course, to take part in the discussion. Thank you very much for all your attention, and I am going to close it now. And
well, can I just make one final point, that anyone who's got ideas about the sort of subject we've been talking about, do consider entering them in our competition for our post-pandemic competition, which is precisely looking for ideas around these sorts of themes, and details are on our website.
Thank you very much indeed. And from London anyway, good morning.
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation, and thanks to everybody.
Thanks, Heather.